Welcome, art lovers, literature lovers, and sports fans, for those of us who are following the World Series, as I am. So my name is Vivian, and I'm a community member at Imago. And Imago Foundation for the Arts, this is our 21st year, which is really wonderful. And we were founded by 8 artists as an arts organization run by artists for artists. And we remain focused on that mission today, and this program is a great example of the community work we do. I hope that you have a chance to walk through the gallery tonight. The exhibition is Chromatics, Deconstructed Landscapes, and it features our IFA artist, Rena Nyatt, and 2 guest artists, Carson Jackson and Phil Boschma. I'm really delighted to introduce you to 2 authors today, Tina Cane and Elisa Gabbert. And let me tell you a little bit about them. So Tina is no stranger to Imago. She served as the former Poet Laureate of Rhode Island from 2016 to 2024, and is the founder and director of Writers in Schools. She established the first Poetry Ambassador program in partnership with Rhode Island Center for the Book, and brought Poetry in Motion program from the New York City transit system to Rhode Island statewide buses. Additionally, she's the creator and curator of distance reading series, Poetry is Bread, and the editor of an anthology by the same name. She's the author of 5 poetry collections and 2 verse novels for young adults, most recently, Are You Nobody Too? Elisa Gabbert is the author of 7 collections of poetry, essays, and criticism, most recently, Any Person is the Only Self. Her other books include Normal Distance, The Unreality of Memory, and other essays, and the word pretty. She writes the poetry column for the New York Times, and her work has appeared in Harper's, The Atlantic, the Paris Review, the New York Times Review of Books, the Believer, the Yale Review, and elsewhere. She lives in Providence. Please give Tina and Elisa a warm welcome. So we thought we'd do something a little different today. The topic is essay, of course. In Tina's book, The Year Murder Hornet, she has a wonderful quote by Anne Carson, which is, "Some conversations are not about what they're about." And even though the backdrop of both Elisa and Tina's books is the pandemic, it's really about so much more. So we thought we'd start with Elisa reading from one of her essays, and then have Tina read some of her essay poems, and then we'd like to chat about it. So Elisa, you'll start us off, and is there anything you'd like to say about the essay before you start reading?
Let's see, is my mic working?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. All right, let me find what I'm reading. This essay is one that I wrote, I feel like I need to look at it to talk about it. There it is. I wrote it towards the end of the first year of the pandemic, going into the second year. You all remember, wasn't that long ago, how long and strange and loopy time was then. And so there's a lot of time markers in the essay. And it's like I was trying to track my changing feelings and experiences of that first year, but while I was still kind of in the year. And yeah, it's mostly about the particular things that I was missing. I almost called it The Comfort of Strangers, but I ended up changing the title. So it's a longer essay. I'm just going to read the first couple of sections, which should be under 10 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to you, Tina. And then depending on what you read, I thought I might at some point read one of my poems, because
Yeah, that'd be great.
my
Yeah.
poems can be very essayistic, and so I feel like we're playing around with
Yeah.
this, the space in between the
Yeah.
essay and the poem. So this essay is called A Complicating Energy. There's a particular stranger from deep in my past I remember. I was 6 years old in a playroom at some kind of day camp. I saw a pretty brunette girl who struck me as older and more sophisticated than I was, though she couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. She was standing with friends, and I wasn't. "Do you have a staring problem?" she said, meeting my gaze. I was shocked, ashamed, and understood I should not look at people for long. But I still stare at strangers. I still have a staring problem. I used to see strangers every day when I commuted to an office on a train. Often I couldn't get a seat, and though I always carried a book, I rarely opened it. The trips were short, the trains were full, and I was never bored. I spent the time looking at the other passengers, their outfits, what they were reading, the interesting neutrality of their train expressions, unrevealing of their interiors. I can't recall any one person I saw on these train rides, but I do remember patterns. Women with still wet hair, even in winter. Men with t-shirts visible under their dress shirts. Children hovering near their parents' knees, unable to get their attention. When I started working from home, I didn't miss seeing my coworkers exactly, at least not as specific people. But I found I missed seeing people in general. I missed the strangers on the train. So I'd wander around a mall after work or go to concerts or museums. Friday night openings are barely about the art. They're about looking good in public. In his 1712 essay, 24 Hours in London, the Irish playwright and politician Richard Steele writes, "I could not believe any place more entertaining than Covent Garden, where I strolled from one fruit shop to another with crowds of agreeable young women around me who were purchasing fruit for their respective families. The 18th century convention of capitalizing nouns transforms these women with their fruit into platonic ideals, or perhaps generic objects. It's as if he were delighted by their sameness, their interchangeability. To people watch, says Baudelaire, is to see the world, to be at the center of the world, and yet to remain hidden from the world, to become interchangeable, one of the strangers. For Virginia Woolf, a wander through the city at dusk was an escape from the trap of being tethered to a single mind, from the oppression of self. The evening hour, too, gives us the irresponsibility which darkness and lamplight bestow. We are no longer quite ourselves." Getting some feedback, is that all right? Is that a little too close?
Oh, I thought I was like, what'd you do?
"Let us dally a little longer," she writes. "Be content still with surfaces only. Strangers are all surface, and if we access their depths, they'd cease to be strangers. We are all surface to them, too, all face. Strangers allow us, in a way we can't at home, or when alone, to be mysterious, unknown. During the early pandemic, I didn't see enough faces. My dreams became crowded, creating company for me. I'd go to dream parties and talk to old friends, sometimes very old friends, people I haven't been in touch with for decades, and make out with dream strangers. I heard once that the strangers you see in your dreams are all real people from your past, people you passed on the street or in other fleeting encounters, but how could you ever prove this? A writer I know told me she had been searching for faces online so she could work on her novel. "I've never had to do this before," she said, "but it's like I can't see my characters anymore. I can't remember the tiny details people have on their faces." I used to read a blog by the psychologist Seth Roberts, where he documented the results of elaborate self-experiments in optimizing his life and daily habits. To maintain a lower weight, to achieve better sleep and better moods. One of the odder things he discovered was what he called morning faces therapy. If I see faces in the morning, I feel better the next day. It's as though people have a basic need to see other people, a bodily requirement, like a recommended daily allowance of humanity. Roberts believed he could satisfy this need by watching talking heads on TV or YouTube, but I'm not so sure. I think we need faces that can see us too. One day I saw a letter from a reader in the Baltimore Sun. "My 8-year-old was sobbing last night because she misses playing with her friends at recess. She misses her teacher, and she is worried that everyone has forgotten her," this mother wrote. The next part made me gasp. At one point, she asked me if she was even real anymore. I felt profound recognition with this child's crisis. The self cannot be too much with itself, it seems. Trapped alone all the time, it escapes by dissolving. We need to be seen, or we feel transparent, even non-existent. For much of the summer of 2020, I had a near constant headache and some other sensation I couldn't describe, not even to myself. I tried to tell people what it felt like, but it was as if I had a tumor in the exact part of my brain that would have given me the language to define it. The sensation was in my head mostly, but it was separate from the pain. It felt related to lightheadedness, but it wasn't lightheadedness. It might have been the opposite. Sometimes I felt like my brain was a little too big for my skull, or that it was ringing, the way ears can ring, or reverberating, like when you accidentally bite down hard on the tines of a metal fork. I'd been having insomnia on and off, as I always have, but one week my sleep was disrupted in disturbing new ways. I would start to drift off, then be jolted awake as if someone had stabbed an adrenaline syringe into my heart. I had the terrifying thought that if I did fall asleep, I would die, and that my body somehow knew this and was trying to keep me alive. The next day, exhausted, I described this in very vague terms to a woman I work with. She asked me if it felt like I was being electrocuted from the inside. I was stunned. It had felt like that. After our phone call, I Googled something like electric shock feeling while falling asleep. I found an article about brain zaps, which are typically a symptom of withdrawal from antidepressants. But I have never taken antidepressants. Could I be in withdrawal from my own normal brain chemistry, I wondered? My pre-pandemic levels of serotonin and endorphins? My intrinsic antidepressants? I Googled the symptoms of morphine withdrawal. Anxiety, rapid heart rate, troubled sleeping. They sounded like the symptoms of anything. Finally, after weeks of idle worrying, I made a telehealth appointment with my doctor. She thought it sounded like anxiety, but she had me come into the office for blood work and ordered a series of tests just in case. I was sure there was something else wrong with me, something much worse, cancer, cirrhosis. In bed at night, I sobbed into my husband's shirt in fear. But everything came back normal. My doctor prescribed a beta blocker to take before sleep, and the panicky feeling in my chest went away, for the most part. The weird sensation in my skull began to recede. At the time, I was immersed in what I thought of as the literature of despair. I'd started talking to myself, not out loud, but in my head. I could not stop attempting to convert my life into language. I read William Styron's Darkness Visible, the novelist's memoir of his suicidal depression. Depression is a disorder of mood, Styron writes, so mysteriously painful and elusive in the way it becomes known to the self, to the mediating intellect, as to verge close to being beyond description. While Styron is in France to receive a major prize, he experiences a sensation close to but indescribably different from actual pain. Oh, I thought, I see. This pain that can't be named is well established. But Styron, while he was afflicted, didn't understand it either. He felt a vague internal doom that drove him to the doctor for weeks of high-tech and extremely expensive tests, which deemed him totally fit. Charlotte Bronte suffered much from loneliness and the frustration of unfulfilled literary ambitions, the critic Brian Dillon notes in Suppose a Sentence. But she describes her own malady as hypochondria. This, he writes, did not mean only what it does today, but rather referred to a melancholic condition that we would now call depression or anxiety. Hypochondria, etymologically, means under the sternal cartilage. Victorian physicians believed there was some digestive component of this condition that gave the sufferer a visionary or exaggerated sense of pain, in the words of Thomas John Graham's Modern Domestic Medicine Manual of 1826. The contemporary sense of hypochondria, unfounded belief that one is sick, is a linguistic narrowing, and clearly pejorative. You think you are sick, but it's all in your head, and not in your sternum. There.
Thank you. Thank you so much. If we could, it would be great if we could silence our cell phones, if we haven't yet. Tina, would you like to introduce what you're going to read? Say a few words?
Sure. Should I read for about 10 minutes also?
Sure.
Okay. I didn't have any of these poems, but I have a group of essay poems interspersed in this book. This is Year of the Murder Hornet. And I wrote this collection during the latter half of the Trump administration and the first most intense part of the pandemic. And so at the time, well, no, not at the time, but during my tenure as poet laureate for 5 years, I had a Providence Journal column space, and I'd write like op-eds. It was supposed to be like poems, you know, and talking about poetry, but I used it in a different way. I curated it, and I invited a lot of other poets to write for it, or I also had people from other walks of life, like a former military interrogator, a public school teacher, the commissioner of education, like just different, a lawyer, a civil rights lawyer, just to, and have them talk about their experiences with poetry. But I also used the column space a lot to try and talk about politics and what was happening in the country, but under the guise of kind of connecting it to poetry, but also with, and it was, you know, an interesting gig for me because I was in a public position and it was a newspaper, but I really wanted, I kind of made a promise to myself when Trump was elected, because I got the call that I became poet laureate the day of the election. And then the next morning, I woke up and Trump had been elected. So it was like this bizarre whiplash of kind of surprise and joy and fear and happiness to total, I mean, just emergency, anxiety, catastrophe. And but all that to say, it was an interesting assignment for me to try it and write these pieces with the hope that anybody would pick it up and read it. I would try to write it in a way that I could say what I wanted to say, but have them not put it down halfway through because they didn't agree with me. So that was an interesting way for me to think about, not persuasive writing, but assertive but neutral writing. So, and I wasn't supposed to use the column that way at all. But they didn't seem to. They were very supportive. I was also reading a lot of essays by Lydia Davis, whose prose I really love, and you know, she does a lot of interest. She had these 2 tomes of essays come out at that time. So I was reading that, and you know, just trying to survive, basically. So I'm going to read a bunch of these. And I don't read many of these out loud when I do readings. I read this one. So I'll start with Essay on Gentrification. And this one's dedicated to my friend Tongo Eisen Martin, who is the Poet Laureate of San Francisco. And you should look him up. Tongo Eisen Martin, he's a genius. Yeah, yeah. So, essay on gentrification, because I'm a native New Yorker, he's a native San Francisco person. Gentrification looms large in our psyche. And I'm also, this has to do with a little bit with like being priced out of the neighborhood I grew up in downtown New York, and then moving to Brooklyn and being an unwitting gentrifier as a result of having been priced out of my own. Essay on gentrification. Gentrification means I have arrived in a manner only half foreseen, as half of me claims culprit or lays claim to my neighborhoods and stoops, spanning shambles to the ramblings of my education. Meaning, I know all about espresso and the benefits of self-expression. Meaning, I still trip myself up as reflex to tradition. For a long line of providing comfort constitutes survival prior to mine. If property is still an interest to protect, it also interests me in other ways. Meaning, I spend my days sweeping the floor, sometimes writing, sometimes imagining a table strewn with pheasant and clattering plates, where a feast takes place in my absence, where plans for repaving move forward without my input or my permission, as I envisioned the wave of a hand prompting someone to pass the bread, to someone who likes their wine cool, their butter soft and lightly salted, someone akin to me, who warms each pat with her breath, a hint of bitter ancestors on it. Essay on poetics or early morning texting with Orlando. This is Orlando White, he's a friend of mine, and we live across the country from each other, and sometimes there's a time zone difference, so sometimes he's up really late and he texts me in the morning and I'm making breakfast for my kids, so that's usually when we correspond. Essay on poetics or early morning texting with Orlando. I'm having trouble writing poetry, he wrote, trouble being a poetry writer. I don't know, I said, write notes of sound, notes of mystery, see what comes. Geese flying, brakes screeching, boots crunching snow on a path, I said. Do you recall the last time the light of shadow reflected off your skin, he asked. In the morning, I said, stretching in bed, low light. We exist, he wrote, because of light. As light, he said. Sound is light's cousin, I replied. Shadow has a sound of whispering. Shadows vibrate like voices, he wrote, like bird bones are hollow, by the way, I said. Sound like wind, I added. Wind moving, he wrote, against the fabric of skin. Feeling wind, the epitome of being in the moment, we agreed. Breath is wind, we said. Write it down, I said. See what the shadow gives. Our breath imitates wind, he wrote. The crux of it, us as wind. Messages in our ears long before the ringing messages of purpose, he said. Mystery of purpose, I noted. Humility of purpose, or mystery, fabric of soul, he wrote. Hella or yours, he said. LOL poetics of geography and self-shadow of words on the page I typed. In person, he said. Insomnia, I said. Sorry. Oh well, we said. Soon. Those are an actual transcript of our text. And I'm not going to read this one because I don't really like this poem. You can go read it and not like it too. Essay on Comfort or Open Letter to Sean Hannity. Essay on the Advancement of Time. My imaginary allegiance to the Anti-Nostalgia Association for the Advancement of Time is partly a reaction to Proust, inspired and ambivalent as my response to the wall of moms in Portland, one rumored note of hope amid all those trees swaying in solidarity with the leaf-blowing dads, earnest, homegrown protectors of women's bodies, ever the bulwark against everything, women's bodies, I mean, even in war, somehow even against the self, somehow. But how can I not be moved to ask by a person's willingness to put their body on the line when I hardly know what to do with mine? Half the time I'm slouching or speaking loudly, using words that convey too much nuance. It's hard. I try not to judge, but love is a process of education, like the Greeks said, which is what the poem is about. Love as a way to reciprocate our imperfections, not bend in surface to a lie. About life, the way women's bodies can sway, carries each day into night, the heaviest of weight made light. Essay on movement. The writer in this poem is Leslie Jameson, who I don't know, and I missed her at Riff Raff, so I didn't get to meet her. But she's also an essayist, nonfiction writer. Essay on movement. There's a writer, I like her mind, how she jotted walk adventure on a slip of paper for her daughter while they were confined to their apartment in New York City. It was good to keep possibility alive, she wrote. I took note, since she and I are both mothers, writers. She was sick at the time with coronavirus, while I was just suffering from fatalism and being far from home. My heart broke almost daily and more for the shuttered stores and filthy delis, the souls being tallied at a distance beneath white tents in Central Park. Walk, adventure, had always been my ethos. I spent half my life walking it off. Across the village, Chinatown and Soho, the Lower East Side. I might have practiced radical acceptance had I known what it was back then. It's not easy picturing the writer I like alone, feverish and huddled in damp bedclothes, her essay on a laptop while her daughter in diapers crawls on the carpet. It's not easy hearing my own daughter describe the day the virus shut her school as frantic but slow, like a fever dream, the way she and her friends hurried to empty their lockers into borrowed paper bags before rushing to the bus, their arms loaded up with books, how she was the only one who didn't seem sad or cry. She said all she felt was freedom, and she didn't know why. Essay on states. The ambient kind, like surroundings, or like jazz. Coltrane, the heart's improvisation, meaning crying as a form of music. Joy of delectable blues, every organ a body with its own aria, whether reverence or arrivederci. States vary depending on conditions. In space, time has to do with how you move through it. In life, my dad said mine was a trial by fire. The whole thing, I exclaimed? I don't know, he said, shaking his head, as I watched my form enter a room full of flames. How does the end of the universe make you feel? A cosmologist on the radio was asking her colleagues as I merged into a lane of cars. Impossible, I shouted. 3 out of 4 vehicles the exact same model and make. It turns out the cosmologist colleagues had mixed feelings about the end of things, like any of us. The laws of physics were purportedly different early on, back when things were in a denser state and everything was like love or a black hole being a zone where light can't escape, love being a time and space outside of place. So, I'll read these 2 other ones. Essay on Beauty or Behold a True Story. So in the beginning of the pandemic, one of the first essays I wrote that was kind of, being written at the time, people were writing on the pandemic. There was an essay in the Paris Review by Sabrina Oren Mark called Fuck the Bread. And it was about her not being able to find yeast and trying to find a job. So that's the reference in this one. Essay on Beauty or Behold a True Story. There once was a man who claimed he couldn't watch Bonnie and Clyde because Faye Dunaway was too beautiful. It's true, beauty hurts, but it's seldom debilitating. Overrated maybe the way Meryl Streep is overrated in the eyes of a man who doesn't find her beautiful enough. Fuck the bread, a writer's mother once said when her daughter couldn't find a teaching job or yeast during a pandemic. The bread is over, she told her, dismissing life as we knew it. In one fell swoop, bread became language to my mind. No longer elastic in form, all leavening lost as bread became love to my heart, a knot of needing and need. Another true story is that I'm a mother and a writer who knows about beauty and bread, about language and interruption. I also know the mirror only tells part of the story of a face. The eyes have it, they say, but the eyes can only hold so much. The way a heart can be full and at the same time broken, divided chambers of a single system split. the way Faye Dunaway kills beauty by being the mother of it, how we break bread to partake of it. So this last one, I think you have a printout. This one's called Essay on Mercy. And I think the thinking was just for you to see what the poems maybe look like as opposed to what an essay looks like. Essay on Mercy. So I wrote this at the point in the pandemic very early on when it was starting to rage, when they were projecting the number of people in New York who would be dead by the end of the week. And I was thinking of people I knew in New York, and it was like, there'll be 10,000 people dead by Thursday. And it was so bizarre to grieve anxiously in advance of something so massive and unprecedented. So that was the feeling here. Essay on Mercy. It's all management before mercy for the suits at the rallies and for those alone in the ICU. Not a single mask to reuse, even for the mothers. Grieving in advance is intense and anguish akin to combat, which it said feels like the second before a car wreck, only all the time. A single prescient moment right before impact that tenses the body for eternity, bruises the psyche and rewrites the system to run solely on adrenaline. But mourning is not war, and Antigone was not her brother. She sought to bury Polynices because ritual is everything, so a warrior she became. Still, mythology continues to bewilder, as if life doesn't train us for death. It all remains grim if we don't see small mercies in our midst, the lessons we might miss, etc. Once when I was young, kissing a boy I didn't love on a mattress in a floor-through off 10th Avenue, I had the feeling I was falling through time. It was then, only then, that life wasn't about saving things, at least not mine.
Thank you, Tina. This is beautiful. Maybe we should start talking about what is an essay. How would you both respond to that?
You've written a lot more essays than I have, so I'll tell you what I think it is after.
Well, yeah, I have a question for you that I'll end with. So,
Oh, okay. Exactly.
Yeah, because I was thinking about it as you were reading those beautiful poems. To me, I mean, the way I always think of an essay is that it's just a record of thinking over a certain period of time. And I think you can play with that a lot, because sometimes I like to write an essay very quickly, but it's everything I've ever thought about a certain question or idea my entire life. But like everything that I can remember ever thinking about something, like self-pity. And I can write it in a day, but it's a record of my thinking about self-pity since I was a child. Other times I start thinking about something and I'm thinking about it for a few weeks, a few months, and the essay is getting written over that time. But it's basically a way of, documenting how that thinking changes and moves over that period of time. And that's, to me, like the loosest definition that still like lets, the form kind of do whatever it will. The subject can be anything, the form can be anything, but to me it has to kind of have that thinkiness about it to feel like an essay. And so my question for you, I mean, you should just answer the original question too, but I'm very curious how calling those poems essays enabled you to do something different with the poem form, what it made possible for you as a poet.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I was thinking as I was driving here, or actually this afternoon, like, well, what are they going to ask? Because I had no idea what they were going to talk about. And I was thinking, well, I guess we'll talk about what an essay is, would be the first thing. So I was thinking about that. And so I didn't do an MFA like a lot of poets have. but I did do a master's in French literature, so I have more of a background in French literature, actually. And so immediately when you say essay, essayer is to try, and in French an essay is an attempt or an effort. And so for me, it has that meaning also. And I realized in connecting with that earlier today, because I really haven't thought about French literature in 30 years, except that I do partake of it, but in a completely different way than, in an academic way. So I was thinking about, well, in connection with your question now, the poems are attempts, and they're efforts, and I mean that. They're really efforts, and certainly there was like this particular time period when so much was happening, and I use that word unprecedented. So much was unprecedented, but there was just such deep anxiety and uncertainty. I think maybe on some level, essay seemed to feel like it was positing a more coherent form than a poem. I'm not sure, but I did feel that I had been enjoying writing essays, and I certainly have read Anne Carson's The Glass Essay, and there are other poets who have alluded to essays in their poems in terms of form. What I noticed I tried to vary, I didn't try, they ended up varied, these poems. Their tones are different, some of what they're doing is a little different. So I didn't go into them with the idea of writing a bunch of them. I wrote one, and then I think what happened was I seemed to connect when I was, actually some of them have almost like a Volta type turn towards the end. So I almost feel like, I don't know if I was their poems that were in particular a form of grappling, and that maybe I felt that essay was seemed like a more reined-in container to call them. I'm not sure, but I do know that the idea of attempt and multiple attempt and failure is kind of like Montaigne's book essay is plural, and they are essays. And actually, with him, what's interesting, he was writing in the 16th century, but he started out as like a really formal. His essays were structured and very formal, but he loved poetry, and so over his career, his essays became more free associating and more deconstructed, and he was kind of lambasted for it. Like, what are you doing? This is crazy. This is just musings. But he was really interested in what you were talking about, like kind of a document of thinking and the way that the mind wends and where it goes. And so, and I think that on that level, sometimes essays and poems are trying to do similar things, So, for me, I think that was a big part of it.
Mm-hmm.
If I could just add one note
Sure.
to that,
Yep.
I think the question that gets asked to me more often than any other when I do events, because I write both poems and essays, is like, what is the difference between a poem and an essay,
Yeah.
or what are the similarities? And it's one of those things that every now and then, just because I've heard it so many times, my brain shuts down, and I just pop up something that I've said a million times before. But every now and then I have a breakthrough, and I realize something about the question, some aspect of it that I hadn't seen before. And there was a time recently that I realized, like, oh, well, I guess, like, essays often start with a theme, and like my poems never do.
Right. Yeah.
But
so
those poems do, and so it's almost like calling them essays enables you to write a poem on a theme without being stuck, because it's very hard to sit down typically and say, I'm going to write a poem about freedom.
Right. Well, but the thing is, they were composed like poems and not like essays. So I sat down not knowing exactly, not having, not knowing exactly where the poem was going to go. And then some of them ended up being essays, and some of them just ended up being poems. So it was a call I made later. And so as I was talking, I was trying to think, like, what was it that I made me want to call essay and gentrification, essay and gentrification, as opposed to fight the power or something. And I think that in that one in particular, I was trying to kind of argue with myself about a duality within me. And so sometimes I feel like there's maybe something rhetorical happening. And actually, I'm working on a collection now, I'm finessing it. And a friend was reading it, and he wrote back to me like, I think you should cut these 2 poems because they're too rhetorical. And I was laughing because I was like, oh, thinking I can go there, and I don't want to be doing that in my poems, even if it's an essay poem. It's, that's not what I'm looking for. It's not satisfying to me, a didactic kind of thing happening in a poem. So that would be one, almost like art for art's sake type thing. That would be one kind of distinction I would make just for myself, although I think, essays can be lyric, and they can be really, use the word dissolve, but, in a totally different context. But some essays can be really diffuse and rambling, and, like Montaigne's as he got,
Tina, do you want to speak to the fragmentation, the fragments in the essay composition? How did you come up with that? Why was that important to the structure?
Well, this is where it's like titles are everything. Because, on the face of it, they don't look, there's a poem like that looks like that in the book, which is distinct at the center. But the essay poems don't look particularly different from the other poems in the book. Which I think is in retrospect, that's kind of interesting. Like, well, why are you? Well, because I said so, I'm calling it that, so, you can think about that and what maybe makes this different from the others. And I think as I look back, I'm thinking, oh, well, maybe because I was trying to do something slightly different. But the spacing and the structure and my line breaks, those are just sort of, I don't use a lot of punctuation. I use space to punctuate. And what's funny is because I almost do something with the stanza sometime that I think I liken it a little bit to paragraphs, which is, like the stanza going room to room, but like a kind of a shift happening, and that's where I break a stanza, but not always.
Well, I think some of the titles have more than one definition. For example, the word movement has more than one definite.
Right.
States has more.
Yeah.
So it enlarges, the conversation that one might find, in a poem. Before we go on, I don't want to ignore the audience questions about essays for the authors, or should we keep going? Yes. We did? Yeah.
There are a few other categories I'm curious about what you guys would say. So there's this memoir, different than an essay. What do you feel about that? And also this whole category of sort of creative nonfiction, prose poem, all that, all these categories.
Yeah.
How do you sort out what it is you feel like you're doing?
Yeah.
So, I think, memoir is an interesting one because it can be like a marketing category.
Right, that's so true, yeah.
A story of a woman's survival or whatever. I think of memoir as more just a mode. Like, you can do memoir in any genre or form. Like, you can write a poem or an essay that has a lot of memoir in it, meaning just you're writing from personal experience and memory. And it's less about like, the package of where you're putting it in the bookstore. So it's all about who's like wielding these terms and towards what purpose. I've thought so much also over the years about like the difference between a prose poem and a short or a lyric, all those things. Like, and that's something, those are terms that get thrown around a lot in creative writing programs, where like the term creative nonfiction comes from. They're very fluid, and I tend to think of all of those things as basically self-defined and aspirational. Like, Anne Carson has come up at least twice tonight. I'm reading Anne Carson's new book, Wrong Norma. Have you read it yet?
No.
It's great. It's just classic Anne Carson. And I first encountered her in my 20s when I was in college. My mind didn't know what to do with it, because it was a book of poetry. Like, my poetry teacher in a poetry class gave it to us, but there was stuff in there that I was like, this feels like an academic paper, but like a weird academic paper. And like, why is it in a book of poetry? It was just, now I'm like, whatever, everybody does that. But at that time, it was truly like baffling and astonishing. And so eye-opening for me. So I do think that there's something the author achieves by, as you were saying, like coming to the page, whether it's after or before, and deciding like, I'm gonna call this, and like the use of that term affects the way the reader approaches it, and that can be, you know, an occasion for like playful ironies, because
Right.
you start to think about like, well, how is this not
Right.
like my idea of that category
Yes.
typically?
Disrupting expectations and all of that. Yeah, no, that's so interesting. Well, I mean, what's great is the French have a word that they use, text. Text, and they use it for lots of things. You know, they don't, there is less of a need, and the French really like to categorize, so it's kind of amazing. But they'll just, you know, and this was maybe a product of the avant-garde or new novel and the kind of fracturing, but they are very happy to just present you with a book of texts and have you deal with, like, you don't know what it is, it's a prose book, it doesn't really matter, they're texts, they're pieces of writing, and that's all they are. You know, do with them what you will, and I find that actually very liberating and wonderful. And I do think that a lot of the categorization stuff does come from marketing or programming. One thing though is that, you know, I was thinking about like the essay is also sort of, I mean, I'm very interested in epistolary poems and letter writing. I'm a big letter writer and always have been. And so the relationship between, I normally wear a gold plate necklace on the back engraved is "This is my letter to the world," which is an Emily Dickinson quote. And I often think about, you know, poems as just letters or missives. And then one word I always use sort of privately to myself is dispatch. These are my dispatches. And a book that I was kind of using in this book that I've written just recently called Dispatches is about Vietnam. But dispatches, you know, from a foreign land, you know, with information, but the foreign land being me to you or to the reader. And so I feel like dispatch and text are like the ways that I just think about writing, because really it's all with a purpose to convey or communicate. So the form is, you know, it should be delightfully disruptive, and, you know, it almost doesn't even matter what the distinctions are unless you're writing for the Providence Journal, you know, or, you know, unless there's really, you know, something, or an academic paper and it has to be presented in a certain way. But in terms of defining poetry, I teach in public schools, and I was just teaching today, and I didn't say it this time because I'll probably do it next week, but normally when I'm teaching very young people who don't know anything about poetry, or what they do know is really, you know, coming from a place that's just going to shut it down for them like right away. I try to baffle them and show them so many different kinds of poems, that like 2-word poems, 1-word poems, minimalist, or list poems, and, you know, just crazy cut-ups and sonnets, just to say, like, look at how much of a spectrum, how freeing this is. Like almost anything can be a poem if the writer's intention is to present it in that way. And then it gets into the idea of intention, and I think that is really the kind of driving force behind defining any kind of writing, is what's the intention on the part of the writer, and then you can accept or reject that. Like, that's not a poem in my book, and, you know, or that doesn't feel like an essay, you know, that seems like a poem. Why is she calling me? You know, but I think the writer's intention, and then just the idea of conveying through language is enough. You know.
That's good. You know, Elisa, you mentioned in Complicated Energy, which I love that title, this issue about being seen or not being seen. And so I wonder, and you're both public figures, right? But I wonder, what does it mean to be seen as a writer? And is that different than what it means to be seen as a person? Any ideas on that?
They're not the same thing. I never thought about that before, that they would be different things.
Because we have, you know, a follow-up question would be, we have artists in the room, right? And is it different to be seen as a writer what's a creative artist than a visual artist? And what does it mean to be really seen?
Yeah, I would be interested to hear from a visual artist on that. I think for me, there's something very inherent in writing that it feels communicative, even if I don't really intend to communicate with anyone. Like even when I just write a note to myself in a notebook, just the fact that I can read it now that I've written it down, that it's outside of me, that feels like an act of communication, and it makes me feel less lonely in a way that I'm kind of fascinated by, just writing words down. But yes, I mean, so much of what I write, I do like want people to read it. There's this act of, or there's this desire for the act to be like completed that way, for people to read it. And then, you know, I think the way that it's similar, in that essay I talk about feeling like not being seen really made me lose my sense of myself entirely. There's also too much, and it's very hard to control. Like getting into the spot where you want to be. Like before a book comes out, you feel like invisible, and you have all this anxiety. Is anybody going to read it? Is anybody going to care? And then like very quickly, it's just it's way too much in too short of a period of time. For me at least, and yeah, it's like, oh my god, another event, oh my god, I can't believe I have to be seen again. Like, but of course the whole reason I've been working on this book for years is because I want people to read it, and I want to talk about it, and I want to connect with people about it. So yeah, I mean, fundamentally we don't know what we want, but
But I want to add to that I think as a reader and fan of yours, I would say one of the ways you're seen is all of your references. I mean, who puts Baudelaire, Virginia Woolf, Brain Zaps, Morning Faces Therapy, et cetera, in who would put that except the unique you, in an essay, and that might be a way, that's the way I think about it anyway, to be seen as a writer. I don't know, Tina, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the way I feel seen is through my writing. And well, what I will say is I don't really have the problem of like overexposure. Even though I was poet laureate, like it was a different type of thing. But but in terms of like poetry is pretty low stakes, at least where I'm at. And I mean, it's high stakes for me because it's what I love and what I do. But so I don't have the problem there with my YA books. Those were bigger publishing houses, and so there's like a national, international thing going on. That scene thing, that is the least satisfying aspect of it, because there is the vulnerability of, will people read it, will they like it? And I really have to put some energy to push that out of my mind, or else I'd never want to do it again. But there was a long period of time. I have 3 kids, and when my youngest was a baby, and then my daughter, when my kids were really little, and I couldn't write at all for years. And I would try and write, and I would like cry in my office with my laptop and put my kids on the floor, and I'd read my poems out loud because they were used to being read to, and that's how I would revise. But it was painful and terrible. But what I did know, and I told this to myself very explicitly, because I had kind of hit a wall where I was like, oh, I thought my first book was going to be published, and then I had a baby, and then no one was interested anymore, and I just couldn't get the momentum back, and I didn't know what to write about. But I did really recognize through the difficulty of that whole period that I was always going to be writing poems and learning how to write poems, because like I say, books were my teachers. I didn't study writing poetry. So all of this is really me learning throughout my whole life, but that I was going to just continue learning to write poems and writing them, even if someone came down and said, no one is ever going to publish any of your stuff ever again. But I knew that I was going to keep doing it, and that actually was a solace. And once I actually made peace with that, because that's truly what I thought was going to happen, it was, it still wasn't easy to write, but I didn't have any anxiety about what the end result was going to be, because I was pretty sure no one was going to propose my work or read it. But what it did do was that it just made me plug away anyway, you know. And so I don't know if that has to do with being seen, but I felt seen to myself.
Yeah, good point.
And I'm also obsessed with the word seen these days, because I have 3 kids who are teenagers. And they say these hilarious things. I'm also obsessed with texting as a mode of communication, but like, I say, okay, so what about that girl you went for coffee with? She left me on scene. So left on scene is when you text somebody or you message them, and you can see that they saw it because it said seen 4 hours ago. And then like, if you're a teenager, it's the worst. And you know that every hour is ticking by. They've read your freaking message and they haven't responded, and you've been left on scene. But I'm obsessed with that phrase. I'm going to do something with it because there's something so layered and potent and deeply vulnerable, and something around that whole phenomenon. And then also just the way that young people feeling seen is a whole nother thing than in the larger world than what we're talking about here. But it's not inextricable, and it's not irrelevant, you know.
No, it's good. Any artist in the room want to talk about feeling seen or feeling unseen?
Yeah.
Anyone, any takers? Yeah, Gary, go ahead.
Sure. I'm a painter, visual artist. I really responded when you said, you know, you're basically going to write for yourself, whether anybody sees it or not. I think that's so important, and it does free you up. You do what you do because it's what you need to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you try to find an audience.
Yeah. And then it's so gratifying when you do.
Yeah.
I mean, and you know, your expectations are pretty low, so it's all pretty good. You know what I mean? I mean, with poetry especially,
Right.
but you know.
But that's what it means to be a writer or a painter, or and I feel that's true. If nobody sees the work, you're still a writer.
Yeah. And you know, what I will say too is because I didn't study with any, you know, poets or I used to come from, and I when I realized that I wait, all these other poets my age have done these programs, they've studied with Creeley, what was I doing? Why didn't I know about this? And I lamented for quite a while around that, but then I sort of comforted myself with oh, it's old school, because all the poets I was reading, there were no MFA programs, they all had jobs and were doing other things, and so that has historically been the way. Artists and writers just did what they did, and maybe they did other stuff because they had to, but there was none of the expectation. There wasn't this big machine or any kind of degree or supposed community around being published or shown, you know, and particularly in the visual art world, it's really, you know, the market has transformed what that means in ways that are really impact the meaning of art, you know, in a lot of ways. So yeah, you know, I would look back to history to comfort myself. Well, you know, wasn't always like that. So, but yeah.
Yeah. So Elisa, I read that you have said that having written 7 books is considered a body of work, and this book is your 7th book, and you've also said after you write your 7th book you'll either retire or die.
No.
And here we are.
Well, not that I would, but that
You could.
I told myself that I could.
No.
That if I did,
It would.
I could still, you know, on my deathbed say at least I completed by my own completely made up definition, my body of work.
Like French oeuvre.
Yes, exactly.
So what are you working on now?
Yeah. Well, and part of the reason that I was telling myself that is because for maybe the past 4 books that as they've come out, I've always been working on something else. I've always had another manuscript in progress. Easy to answer the question, what are you working on now? What's next? Yes, exactly. Yeah, I was tired of it. I wanted to like go away for a while, like, you know, Kate Bush and the 90s. Just, yeah, give myself a chance to reinvent myself a little bit, maybe, to be unseen for a little while. So I'm writing poems, but as you say, it's
which
easy.
are great, yeah.
It's
'cause
great
you
to
had
like
some-
hide in poems.
Yeah,
like,
yeah. Well, yeah, that's such an interesting, well, yeah, and I love your poems, so that's a good mode to be in, yeah, right.
But yeah, I'm
Switch
trying
hitter.
not to
Switch
think
hitting,
about
yeah.
like the next book so
Yeah.
much.
Right,
Like,
we were
like
talking
the-
about, we were talking about that when we last saw each other, right, which is just the joy of the work and not working towards any particular,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
good.
yeah.
That's really good.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your latest book, your new book?
Yeah, it's not, I mean, I don't, my editor hasn't read it, so I don't know if it's gonna be published, but it's called Search Engine. And it's about, well, in this book, there's a long poem called Of All Things, and it was the last poem that I wrote of this body of work, and I put it in the book kind of like at the last minute, but it seemed like it needed to be there. And it's the first time that in a poem I allude to my three fathers. And without getting into the really complicated family insanity that is mine, I had three fathers. One was the very young man who was married to my very young mother when she had me, and he was a Marine in Vietnam. They like met in the village and got married and had me. When my mom had me when I was 19, they were married when she was 18. And then I didn't grow up knowing him past the age of 3, because he had, you know, what they would call shell shock and, you know, PTSD now, and their marriage kind of fell apart, and then I wasn't in touch with him for my entire life. But I was raised by a really loving stepdad who was, if you've read my book, Once More with Feeling, there's a long poem in there, Sirens, which is kind of a eulogy to him. He was an actor, and he wanted to be a writer. He was a New York City cab driver for 40 years from Brooklyn. So he was my dad, and he raised me, and that's my dad. But then about 8 years ago, I got a DNA test as a gift. And ostensibly, I'm half Chinese and half German and some other stuff. But when I got my DNA test back, because my Marine dad was Cherokee and German. But when I got my DNA test back, I was half Chinese and half Greek, southernmost, like Sardinian, Italian. So I was like, oh. And when I tell the story, I said, like, we were on a 5-hour road trip with our kids, my husband and I, like, and I got the thing on my phone, I was like, oh. I was like, what's that about? So they were like, well, we waited 5 hours to talk about it. Like, well, if your grandmother was German, but she was with a Sardinian guy, then you would, it's like, I'd still be a quarter German. There's literally no Western European at all. So it became clear by the end of the car ride that my mom had like stepped out on my dad while he was in Vietnam or something, right? We didn't know what. I did another DNA test, it confirmed it. I was like slightly more Tunisian. But anyway, so that threw like a whole kind of, it didn't shatter me the way it might someone else, because my identity was sort of kind of fractured and fractious, and you know, like I'm basically New York, that's what I am. But suddenly I realized that this trio, the mystery around all these men, these 2 men, and then my dad who I knew, was worth mining. Basically, without, you'll have to read the book, but while I started writing that book, by a series of really fortuitous coincidences, I became in touch with my Marine dad for the first time in 50 years. And then he and I embarked on a phone relationship for 1.5 years, where we talked on the phone every week and kind of got to know each other and tried to piece together, you know, what we had missed and what had happened. But that's all I'll say, because it gets really, really complicated after that, and you'll just have to read the book if it gets published. And if it doesn't, I'm okay with that.
So we're about to wind up. Any questions from the floor before we go? We're good? Anything either one of you want to say that we didn't get a chance to say?
Would you read the poem?
Yes,
Yeah.
great idea. I thank you.
Oh.
Yeah, I love your poems, and
I was trying to think if there's one of these that feels especially essayistic.
I really like the accompaniment.
Yeah.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
very fun. I mean,
It's like
essays.
really great.
At first, I didn't at all because
Yeah.
it was really hard to
Yeah.
hear Elisa.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But I've gotten used to it, so
Yeah.
it seems to have sort of quieted it a little
right,
bit.
it's like ding, ding, ding.
Yeah, somebody's studying the piano or something.
I'm sorry about that too. I was trying not to be too distracted, but it was difficult.
Exactly, it was.
So I'll read this poem called Jealousy is the Gin.
What's the name? The what?
Jealousy is the gin. Gin. I know it doesn't make sense. That's what the poem's about. Once in my lifetime, I heard someone say, envy is vermouth, jealousy is gin. For years I have pondered and not understood what this meant. Envy is but what we rinse the glass with. Wanting what others have makes their wanting what you have more delicious. Vermouth is aged wine, and envy is jealousy plus the dimension of time. Jealousy is envy remembered, or envy is jealousy pre-remembered in the future when we get what we desire. Envy is not admiration. I want what they have instead of them. I only envy who I despise. When I totaled my car, my father advised me to buy a new one outright. I had the money to do it, but I didn't want to do it. What I thought was, maybe before the car is paid off, I'll die. It's like I like the idea of my corpse having debts. It's like I like the idea of death as a form of general revenge. I envy the brave. I want someone to be brave. And I'm glad when they fail. The failure of others does not interfere with my futurish gaze. Nietzsche called envy a slave morality, or ressentiment, resentment, that is, re-feeling. Your feeling, but now it's mine.
So good.
Okay, well, yes, Bill, go ahead.
So, us artists tend to collect books, and I would love to hear both of your thoughts on your books being published, not as the success of the publishing, but as these treasures in your life and each other's lives in the collection of, at a time where those things are not happening as often.
Well, I love the physical. There is something, as much as you sort of say, like, well, if no one ever publishes it, like, then I'll just keep writing it, and that's true. But there is something really lovely about the physical. It's always really great. What's weird, though, and even when I got this new first novel for young people, I don't look at the book when it comes. Like, I look at it, I do, and then I don't open it. It's really weird. And I don't know why. It's like a weird superstitious thing, but like my name is right and everything, and that. And then I have so sometimes I don't actually have, and after I've written it, there's been a period of time. I wrote it, and then it went through this whole process, and now I'm usually, if I'm not working on something else, I'm in another headspace. So there is this funny thing where it's like, oh, it's so great to have the physical thing, because I like paper, I can't read on a phone and all that, so I really cherish the object, but I actually don't spend time with it in the way that I would even think I would, I don't know if other people are like that, but.
A little.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think my own books are a little bit like, it's like magnets,
Yeah,
like the
yeah,
wrong end.
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's really
Yeah.
salient to me, but it
Yeah.
has a kind of
Yeah.
repressive
Yeah.
energy that I don't like really want to be too close to it.
Yeah, it's funny, and it's not what you'd expect because we both are drowning in books in our own homes. We love everybody else's
Absolutely.
the objects. I mean, I do think it's really satisfying,
Mhm.
but the magnet analogy is really true.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, before you have a book, you're so obsessed with the idea of having
Right.
a book, and I think it's partly like, yes, you have to eventually come to this more philosophical idea about like, that's
Right.
not really why I'm writing, but
Right.
you get really fixated on it
Right.
early on
Right.
because the
Right.
way that you found writing was through books.
Yeah.
Like as a kid,
Yeah.
you went to
Yeah.
the school library, or
Yeah.
I mean, my mother would take me to these little like paperback exchange,
Yeah.
like, just the cheapest like mass market paperbacks, and you could buy them for like $2 or $3 or something, and she would sell them and buy more. And there was like a rack of kids'
Yeah.
books. So yeah, there's something about just like the
Yeah.
size and shape of a book that it feels like that's the tradition I want to be a part of.
Yeah.
I imagine it's the same like you want your painting to be on a wall. Like that's part of
Right.
that's part of what you're kind of aspiring to.
And I don't find that like technology, I don't find that like there's been this big death of the printed book. I mean, I don't know what the numbers are, and maybe it's because we're writers, we're seeking them out and around them a lot, but there's a lot of, I mean, it doesn't seem like, I mean, I know bookstores have closed and there's the giant, Amazon and everything else, but there's still, a lot of books out there, like they're still being bought and read in physical form. And I'm not against ebooks, I can't read them, but I know tons of people do. So I feel like, if that was the way that people would be more apt to read, great, who cares? Like, I like paper, but if someone will read off a screen and they'll read a lot, then that's great, But, and audiobooks and all that. It's so funny, because I saw one of my kids, their last question on Google was, is listening to an audiobook cheating? I was like, that's a really good question. Like, do you have to have taken the words in through your eyes to, Anyway.
Tina, what is the title of your new book going to be? You probably said.
Search engine.
Oh, right, search engine, thank you.
I was just going to say, I sort of have a different relation with my work. And I was just imagining that yours is because you've been living with the words and maybe printing out, or maybe you're writing, handwriting instead of on a computer or something like that. And so you've kind of lived with it for a long time. And so having it in a published format doesn't mean, but like, especially because, for the last 7 years, I've been doing exclusively digital compositions. So I'm always seeing my work on a screen.
Okay. Yeah.
And so when it's actually printed,
Right. Yeah.
and I find that I keep looking at it, because all of the time that I've been creating it, I only see it on a screen,
Right.
and the physical object versus what you see
Right.
on the screen is so different.
That is a different.
So it's kind of like a little bit of a flip
Yeah.
from what you two experience with it.
Well, also writing, I mean, there's so much editing
Yeah.
involved. You go through all these sort of different versions.
Yeah.
And, like,
Yeah.
it doesn't have the aura of a single
Yeah.
object.
Yeah.
You know.
Also, my problem too is I'll want to, like, even as I'm reading, I'm fucking revising it again. I'm like, why didn't I change that? Like, And it's not that I want to go back and change it necessarily, but
Okay.
it's an ongoing, and the more, when you talk about body of work and like 7 books, the more I think about my own work, at least, the more I think it's all one work. It's all one work, and it's just doing something different at each pass or each book or whatever. So in a way, like it's constantly like a living document to me, and so this feels really final in a way that's a little frustrating, even though it's very gratifying. It's like, okay, well, I did that, I committed to that, so it's there. And I can't do anything, so I don't actually want to engage with it too much. Maybe that's what it is that, So.
Yeah,
So when you actually read something out loud, how do you relate to it when you're reading it?
Yeah, I feel like somebody asked me once, like, oh, how do you make, like, when you perform, how do you make it sound like you want it to sound? And I was like, oh, well, you have to figure out what you want it to sound like first, and then write that piece.
Right.
Like, thinking about it all backwards.
Right.
Yeah, so there's definitely, especially with poetry, like way more than prose actually,
Yeah.
for me. Like I'm writing towards the place where I can read it, and it feels right to read out loud.
Right. And you read out loud when you revise, because I do. Yeah, all the time.
Yeah. But it's also like I almost don't even need to,
Right, because the voice gets in your head.
Yeah, exactly. The voice
Yeah.
of me reading out loud is so ingrained in the
Yeah.
writing of a
Yeah.
poem that it's like
Yeah.
pounding in my head
Yeah.
when I'm writing.
Yeah.
Less so with prose.
Yeah.
But I actually want to change that because for this book, I read my audiobook the first time I've ever done that.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah, and it's absolutely going to change the way I write, because if there's ever a really long sentence with like too many clauses and embedded quotes, it's
so
really hard to read out loud.
Oh, interesting.
A bunch of names I didn't know how to pronounce.
Right. That's great.
Yeah, so
That's
shorter sentences from here on out.
Or just have someone else do the audio for it next time.
So there's the answer for your child.
Funny, yeah. Funny.
Okay, we want to
Thank
thank
you.
thank our authors. So books are for sale in the back. Please look at our exhibit, and thank you so much for coming.
And when Search Engine or your next book are published, we'll come back.
Sure. Thank you.
I have it written down here too, I asked the question. Oh, that's good.
Oh, thanks.
Mine's not
It was
terrible.
interesting I'm reading this book called How Art Works by
Thank you so much. That was so great.
Ellen Winter.